Well, thank you, Amy. Nice to be here again. We were here on the day when you officially became the river, I think, and we sort of did the water thing here and said we were on side with you here. So it's nice to see some of you are still here. A bit of a remnant because of the holiday weekend, and school holidays and stuff, but the Bible has a lot to say about the faithful remnant, so you can feel good about yourselves this morning. So, Amy said to me, which of these disciplines would you like to speak on? And I looked at the Sabbath and I thought, it's the only command in the Old Testament that doesn't get mentioned in the New. So I thought, I wouldn't mind having a go at this. So this morning you can hear the result of my musings on this topic. Now, I want to tell you a story to start with about an American Jewish woman named Joy Davidman. Well, she was brought up in an American Jewish home. Her father was an atheist. They were obviously non-practicing Jews, and so she grew up as an atheist too. She said she was very arrogant and so on as a young, precocious teenager. And then she joined the Communist Party. And while she was a communist, she met a fellow named William Gresham, so she got married and she became Joy Gresham. And but she was dissatisfied, and so the two of them actually began a spiritual quest. She was greatly helped by the writings of C.S. Lewis, but as they went on with the spiritual quest, her husband lost interest, and he was more interested in grog and other women actually. So the marriage tragically ended. But she carried on with her spiritual quest, and she started a correspondence with C.S. Lewis and eventually invited herself over to England to meet him. And Lewis found her a very stimulating person to be with. He said he never met a woman like her. Intellectually, she was like his equal, and they got on very well together. Anyway, she went back to the US and brought her two sons back over to England. And the relationship continued. And then her visa ran out and she had to go back to America. But Lewis said he would marry her in a civil wedding so she could stay in the UK, which was a rather interesting arrangement. And then eventually he realized how much he really loved her. And so by this stage she had cancer. And so in the hospital bed, they were married as a Christian marriage, and some of you may have seen the movie Shadowlands, the story of their relationship. It was very moving, a movie. Why I'm telling you all this is that once she'd become a Christian, she wrote a book called Smoke on the Mountain about the Ten Commandments. And it was interesting from a Jewish background perspective on the Ten Commandments. And in the chapter she writes about the Sabbath, she tells this story, imaginary story, about a group of aliens who visited the earth, and they were trying to figure out what the religion of the earthlings was. And they decided fairly early on it was sun worship, because they had a day called Sunday, which is obviously dedicated to their god. And on a Sunday, they noticed that when the weather was fine, large numbers of people would flock to the seashore and take off almost all their clothes and anoint themselves with holy oil and then cast themselves in obeisance to the sun. And then they'd shriek with religious ecstasy as they dived into the waves and so on. So that was her take on the secular understanding of the Sabbath in the world we live in today. So what's the idea of the Sabbath? Well, we'll go back to Exodus where we first mention it in Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Several key things about this. It's a very gracious provision. One day you don't have to work. You know, the boss hasn't got control of your life 24/7. It's a very gracious provision. In many parts of the world, it just simply doesn't exist. You know, you've been hearing about slavery. I mean, there's people in the world that the idea of one day a week where you had freedom from work is just an incredible thought. So there's a break from work, and then it talks about creation. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. You know what he said when he rested on the seventh day? He saw the wonders of creation and thought, this is very good. Interesting little human picture of God. He looked at his creations. So I think there's this idea of the Sabbath. You get away from the work that you've got to do every other day of the week and have a break and appreciate the wonder of creation. It's an amazing world that we live in. One day a week. It's interesting, I understand that when the French Revolution happened and the French had 10 on the brain, you know, everything had to be 10. They tried to implement a 10-day week. It didn't work. And productivity went down. And animals died, actually, because they flogged them too hard. And so they gave up, went back to 7 days. There's a second mention in the books of the law in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy, it mentions again about the Sabbath, but it gives a different reason for it. This is Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. You notice the reason for the Sabbath? It was to reflect on the wonderful redemptive power of God. Because to the Old Testament, the Exodus, this amazing act of God's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, the equivalent in the New Testament is the resurrection of Jesus. And this is the core thing, that when we take a break from work, we reflect on God's wonderful redemptive power we see in the resurrection of Jesus. So, but it wasn't just the Sabbath, because when you read on in the Old Testament, you get to Leviticus, which very few of us do actually read. You'll find there was a threefold provision from God. First of all, there was the Sabbath, 1 day a week. You can be freed from the tyranny of work. But then there was the Sabbath year, that every 7th year, the land itself was to have a break. And imagine if that was followed today, instead of pouring chemicals on the ground and trying, to increase the productivity all the time, which is so you make more money. You gave the land, the provision in the Bible is the land was given a break. So there was the Sabbath year, and then every 7 times 7 Sabbath years, there was the year of Jubilee. So there was 49 years, and then in the 50th year, they had the year of Jubilee. That was amazing, because in the year of Jubilee, there was provisions that affected the whole of society. The thing about the year of Jubilee is the debts were forgiven, the slaves were freed, and the land reverted to its original owners. What's happened during that period, see, the land gets sold, and there are some people getting very rich and very fat on this kind of thing. And every 50th year, the trumpets would blow in the land, and the year of Jubilee would be proclaimed. Now, there's some debate, actually, about whether the year of Jubilee ever actually happened, because the way society and the economy works is the wealth in society goes up, and after 50 years, guess who owns all the trumpets? And so there's no motivation for the rich guys who own the trumpets to blow the trumpets and proclaim a year of Jubilee when they're going to have to lose all their riches that they've accumulated. It's a sad commentary and what might never have happened. But the provision from God was wonderful for a society based on economic justice. And even in a society like New Zealand, there's a few people at the top who are getting richer and richer, while the people at the bottom are just struggling. And so God's intention was it would never to be like that. But there's a problem, in that we humans have a kind of default setting, that the idea of grace is just too hard to live with. You know, this was a gracious provision from God. 1 day a week, 1 year in 7, 1 year in 50 years for an economically just society. It's a provision of grace. The problem is grace is too hard to live with, because we have a default setting, all of us within us, that grace gets turned into law. Because you see, what happened for the Jewish community, once they were established in the land, the scribes and the lawyers got together and they started saying, well, you're not to work, so what is work? And so they started having these arguments about what can you not do, rather than having talk about what can you do, what can you not do. And so by the time we get to Jesus, the times of Jesus, I understand there were 1,521 things that were actually forbidden. And it got down to tiny minutiae of things. The Sabbath is actually an interesting experience. A few years ago, we had a couple from Spraydon who were working in Israel with a Christian organisation that was ministering to Jews, and the organisation actually paid for Marge and I to come over to Israel, and we spent a couple of weeks there. It was an absolutely fascinating experience. And we were there for 2 weeks, and one of the weeks we were in Jerusalem during the Sabbath. And it was actually a fascinating experience. It's interesting standing at the bus stop late Friday afternoon, because the Sabbath begins at sundown. And so late in the Friday afternoon, everyone's scurrying to the bus stop to make sure they get home before the Sabbath begins. And then on the Friday evening, they have a little religious ceremony. They light the candles, the candelabra, and they light all that and have a little ceremony. And then on a Saturday morning, people going around saying to each other, Shabbat Shalom, peace to you on the Sabbath. It's all very nice. But then there's the other side of it. And the couple we were staying with, they told us that on the Sabbath, there was an Orthodox Jewish couple in an apartment just along from where they were. And what would typically happen was the daughter from this family would appear at their door with, for example, a can of beans in her hand. And she'd just stand there. And they'd say to her, do you want us to open the can of beans? And she'd say yes. Because you see, that's work. Well, they defined it. The scribes defined it as work, and you're breaking the Sabbath. So they'd open the can of beans and give it back to her. And it got to this absurdity. And so what did Jesus do when he encountered this kind of stuff? Well, we read about it in Mark chapter 2, verse 23. It says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisee said to him, look, Why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And he answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" That's a profound saying. The Sabbath was made for man, or for humans. We weren't made to conform to all his rules and stuff, but it was made for us, a wonderful provision of grace. We're about to lose everything here. I'm sure I had another point to make. Yeah, here we go. In Mark chapter 3, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. It's incredible. This is the point, that the observance of all these rules and rituals had become so important to them that when God appeared in human form and did these wonderful works of grace and mercy, they couldn't even see it. This is the power of religious ritual and tradition. Very, very scary thing, really. For them, it was the fact that he healed people on the Sabbath was sufficient to kill him. And then something staggering happened, absolutely staggering. We read about it in all four Gospels, but from Luke 24, on the first day of the week, the Sabbath was over. Very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. On the first day of the week, Jesus was raised from the dead. From there on, the followers of Jesus began worshipping not on the Sabbath, but on the first day of the week. Even though this was a working day, it meant that when they gathered for worship, they had to gather either first thing in the morning or late at night. But they did. And in fact, there's a lot of instances in the New Testament that talk about them worshipping on the first day of the week. So why is this significant? Well, the interesting thing is that you don't change the pattern of centuries just on a whim, or because someone has a bright idea about it. It's actually a powerful argument for the reality of the resurrection of Jesus on the first day of the week, that these new followers of Jesus, who were Jews, would overturn one of the commands of Scripture in order to do something quite different. Because Sunday was the day of the new creation. And so that's why we worship on a Sunday. Because this has transcended the Old Testament commandment of the Sabbath. There has been a new creation. Jesus has been raised from the dead on the first day of the week. That's why we're here today and not yesterday. And so in the early church, of course, there was a difference over this, because for the Jews, the Sabbath was still important. But for the Gentiles who came to faith in Jesus, well, they had no exposure to the Sabbath at all. So a debate occurred. And so Paul addresses this. But let's have a look at some of these passages where, like for Acts chapter 20, for example, we read, on the first day of the week we came together. This is Luke writing about the first day of the week we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. Now, you may have some preachers who you feel go on far too long, but I don't think anyone's ever gone on that long. Poor Eutychus was sitting in the window, and he fell to his death. That's because Paul just went on talking, and probably not many preachers put people to death when they're preaching, and they went out and Eutychus was raised from the dead. It's an amazing story, but there's a lot of messages in here. I think you could, a lot of points you could develop as a preacher about this particular incident. But they were the point is here, they were worshipping on the first day of the week. And then in 1 Corinthians, we read, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. And then this interesting one from Revelation chapter 1. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. In other words, he was persecuted. On the Lord's Day, so this is no longer Sunday, this is the Lord's Day. The Lord was raised from the dead. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches. So here's this pattern in the New Testament. But there was a dilemma, because for the Jews, the Sabbath was still important. They'd grown up with this all along. For the Gentiles, the Sabbath didn't mean anything, really. And so Paul addresses this issue in Romans. And what he says, that one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind, which is a profound attitude that when in the Christian community, when different people have different points of view, Paul says you need to be fully convinced in your own mind and appreciate that different people do have different perspectives on things. So then it was really with the Protestant Reformation when people started taking the Bible seriously again, this whole question of the Sabbath came up. Is Sunday the new Sabbath? This is what the Reformers asked. Is Sunday the new Sabbath? And in which case do we need to implement what the Jews did? And the answer generally was yes. There were some Christian groups like the Seventh-day Adventists and others who said, well, no, we should worship on the Saturday, on the Jewish Sabbath. But the testimony of the early church is that the day for worship is the first day of the week. This is the rationale for our worship, is the resurrection of Jesus. This is the new creation. We are the people of the new beginning, the new creation. This is a day of celebration. But the Reformers, the general point of view was the Sabbath should be reinstituted, as it was in the days of the Old Testament. But unfortunately, because of human nature, grace gets transferred into law. And so the same thing that happened in the Jewish community started happening within Protestant Christianity. My dad was born in Scotland. Now, this is over 100 years ago. But he told me that when he was a little boy in Scotland, his toys got put away on a Sunday because this was the Sabbath. And he didn't do any work. I don't quite see how you were working when you were brum, brum, brum around the floor with you. But, his parents thought that was work. So of course, in the 20th century, there was a rebellion against that. But now we've ended up that there's nothing special about Sunday at all, And so which raises the question for us today, is there any relevance in this teaching? And the answer is yes, emphatically. There's profound relevance in this teaching about one day in 7. The boss can't control your life. There's an awful lot of people today in our society who are driven by their work. I don't know if you saw an article in The Listener last month. There was a cover story called on the theme of how to stop work overwhelming your life. And what the article was, a very interesting one. It was saying that when technology appeared, the idea was that this would make our work-life balance so much better. We'd have so much more leisure time. And said they didn't understand that there would be emails. And the boss would be able to send you emails any time of the day or night. And these beeps would continue, and they put the headline of their article was called "Beep Off." Turn the thing off. That they were saying that in some European countries now, there's been legislation passed that employers are not allowed to contact their employees beyond work hours, because it had got to such a point that people couldn't get away from their work. And that's the situation we're facing now. And they quote a psychologist who said that modern life leaves us depleted. And so the challenge for all of us, I think, is how do we take this principle of the Sabbath? Because that's, I think, what it had become in the days of the New Testament. There was a new beginning. This is the Lord's Day. This is a day of celebration and worship. How do you take the principle of the Sabbath and apply it to the society that we live in today? Because for a lot of people today, they've got to work on Sundays or they've got other commitments. So how do you apply this teaching today? Because it is a wonderful teaching. Work shouldn't control your life. God should control your life. And one day a week you can celebrate that with rest and with worship. I faced the challenge with this. I was a pastor. Well, I suppose I still am, but for 40 years I pastored this church, which actually ended up being very big, and Sunday was the busiest day of the week. It was a wonderful day for worship. It was a seriously large congregation, and we had, on a normal Sunday, 3 services, 2 in the morning, 1 at night. It was very big crowds. So it was terribly busy. And as for a day of rest, well, forget it. It was the busiest day of the week. So Monday, I took a day off, and I religiously observed it. If people wanted to talk to me about churchy things, on a Monday I told them, beep off, Away you go. I'm not going to do it. And so religiously I did that on, if you wanted to strike a grumpy man, you'd talk to me about spiritual things on a Monday. I wasn't paid to talk to you, see? It wasn't quite that bad. The problem is that people keep dying, and so an awful lot of funerals happen on a Monday, I notice, a disproportionate amount. But I think for all of us, we have to face this dilemma. How do you do justice to this provision, this wonderful provision of God in the Old Testament? That one day a week, you need to take a break from work, and you need to appreciate the wonder of creation and give thanks to God for his redemptive love to us. And somehow, every one of us in our situation today has to face the challenge of how do you do this? Because it isn't as easy as it was for the Jews way back then when there was a day when everything was stopped. And how do you do it without turning it into some legalistic thing? Yeah. But you appreciate this is a day of celebration. And most of us, I think, probably can do that on the one day. And you can take